For decades, the name Charles Manson has been synonymous with evil, horrible crimes, and now lies. The time has come to tell the real stories, to expose the fabrications, and to set the record straight. This is the Redemption Podcast Show, and I'm its host, John Krotek. On this exclusive series of the Truth Files, Jason Freebird Freeman, grandson of the notorious cult leader, and myself will discuss facts and reveal truths never been told before. Jason has no doubt justice will prevail. The truth is on his side. So is redemption. Thank you for listening. I want to welcome everybody back to the Redemption Podcast Show with Jason Freeman, grandson of what many people can think is the most notorious cult figure on the face of the planet. We've been going through truth and truthful conversations, and we have a super cool guy. His name is George Stimson. George he's living out in California, Northern California. I just found out. So I want you to know everything that we do is on the up and up. You know, this is an integral conversation. He's an author of a good book. He's an environmentalist. And the cool thing about George Stimson, from what I've heard from Jason and those who know him, is that he is a legitimate bona fide truth seeker. So he's the type of guy that we want to hear and talk to. He wrote the book back in 2014 called Goodbye, Helter Skelter. It was a new look at the Tate-LaBianca murders, which everybody and their brother knows occurred back in 1969, a little over 50 years ago. George himself had over 200 visits to the jailhouse to visit Jason's grandfather. And in the course of those conversations, George was able to put together his own truthful story with all of this research. And it's something that we need to hear. But, you know, I'm not great at giving introductions. I'm just here to help facilitate the truth. And I just want to say, Jason, thanks for being here again. We've been on this ride together. Awesome. And George, thank you for deciding to take the time to be with Jason and me and to talk about you and the part that you have in the Charles Manson story. But tell us, so welcome, George. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first, speaking of the truth, I just want to clarify one thing. I had just under 200 visits with Charlie. I didn't quite make it to 200, but it was 180 something. I had records of all that, but that all got lost in the fire. So I'm a pretty good record keeper, but it turned out to be for nothing. But I guess I can tell you a little bit about this case. I've been interested in it since 1975 when I was a senior in college, and I read about Lynette Fromey going to see President Ford in Sacramento. And that brought the attention of her, and by the same way, the Tate-LaBianca murders to my attention. I've always been a true crime buff. So at the time, I was reading whatever true crime books I could get at the time. So the college library had a copy of Helter Skelter, which I took out and read. And, you know, interesting, taken in itself, I guess, a long time ago. It seems like it might make sense if you didn't look into anything else. But it just whetted my curiosity, and I kept wanting to look into other versions of the case and people's memoirs or whatever, anything I could find out about it. And the more I looked into it, the less the Helter Skelter scenario made sense to me. So when that started not making sense to me, I wanted to find something that did make sense to me. So I started looking for that. And it took many years of contacting people, reading everything I could get, watching any videos I could get. Eventually, like I say, corresponding with people. Eventually, I got to know people who were close to Manson, and they introduced me to him. And then I got to know Sandra Good, of course, who knows Manson since 1968. And between all that, I wrote him a letter, and he sent me a visiting form. After we corresponded for a little while, I started visiting him. So after I started visiting him, I moved out to California so I could live near the prison to make it easy to visit him. So I moved to Hanford, which is about 20 miles away from Corcoran, and stayed there.
So tell us about your first visit. So you're doing all this background research. You started long before you actually got to meet Charles Manson. Um, that's pretty. That's doing your homework. What was it like? How did you finally get that pass to come see him?
Well, he sent me a visiting form, and I sent it in. And the rule is that if the inmate, or if you're refused visiting, the institution will let you know. And if you're not refused visiting, they just come visit. So I never heard anything. So eventually I just called them up and said, "Hey, did I get approved or not? I haven't heard anything from the inmate." And they said, "Well, yes, you have." So I made a special trip out to come see him. He was in the security housing unit at that time, the first time I saw him, which is A.H.O, they call it. So the visit would be behind glass for about an hour. And I remember going down there. There were a lot of mixed thoughts in my mind. I didn't know what the physical experience of being in the prison would be like. I thought, they might have the most dangerous man in some bunker 10 stories underground that you'd have to go down to,
Right.
and
Supermax. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what they called it. As an aside, they called it Supermax, but I was amazed at how often it seemed to be super lax. But uh, you know, anyway, so I went down there to see him in A.H.O, and I walked in. So I was really surprised just to get to him. You walk through two fences outside, 16-foot fences with razor wire on them, and then you walk across maybe 100 feet or so of field and walked in a door and then in another door, and there he was behind glass. So he wasn't 10 stories underground. So that was kind of surprising to me that he was just a few doors away from being outside. He was, as I said, behind glass when I first visited him, and I walked in, and the guard took my ID at the raised desk and pointed to him, and he was sitting in his little cubicle talking to one of the guards on the other side of the door where he got let in. And I walked up to him, and he turned around, and there he was right in front of me live, pretty much skinned out, but it was amazing to really lay eyes on him in person for the first time. And I looked at him, and he said, "Hey, man, it's about time you got here." And I said, "Oh, how are you?" And he put his arms out, and he said, "I'm perfect, man." And then he launched into this monologue that went on for an hour that, it went everywhere. And it'd be impossible to recall. But I just remember listening to him intently and trying to make sense out of everything he said. I wanted to engage him all the time, because you never know. What if he does have some power, So I'd look him right in the eye.
Right.
Are you getting anything? Are you sucking out my brain, Charlie?
Right.
It was surprisingly just like talking to some older fellow. I mean, he was 20 years older than I was at that time, I guess. And he was younger than I am now. So he was in his 60s, I think his early 60s. So he was still quite a young, vibrant man.
So so he's all over the place that first visit. You're trying to decipher what he's saying. What was your impression? I mean, the initial impression of the hour that you were there on that first visit, George.
I was kind of, disbelief that it happened, really. I mean, Charles Manson is such a huge person that to be standing there looking at him, just to be looking at him, much less how it got to be later when I was in there with him all the time on contact visits and doing all sorts of things together. But
Yeah.
it was just like seeing the Emperor of Japan or some president of the United States, just a very famous, well-known personage. And there he was right in front of me that I'd been reading about for years. And I went back to see him again the next day. And that pretty soon after that, I moved out so I could visit him more regularly.
So you had, 185, 187 visits, which is a lot of visits over a long period of time. And can you tell us, George, a little bit about how trust entered into your guys' conversation, how that worked out? Because he
Trust.
obviously trusted you.
Well, no, I'm not going to say that. I have to tell you, I've been reflecting a lot lately in the last few years about my relationship with Charlie and how he was and how I perceived him to be. And I have to say that honestly, the only person he really trusted was himself. So even me being there, it didn't
Yeah.
matter how well intentioned I was or how honorable I was. From his experience, the only person he could really depend on was himself. And even after 10 years of doing things with him, he still kept me at arm's length. And he just, I don't think Charlie took his final measure of me until he was near the end, when he could really look back and see the whole almost 30 of our experience together.
That's good. That's good, George.
Yeah, because we had our ups and downs and some pretty big downs, and there was a long time when I didn't speak to him because of miscommunication and prison intrigue and all kinds of stuff going on. Very complicated. I mean, there was so much going on, and so many of the people in there that I knew that were in the unit with him, and people I had to deal with outside. He'd hook me up with people, and it was just really something that people don't realize how much we had going on together in all that time. It wasn't just a casual, how are you doing? He was always asking me to do things, and I always tried to accommodate him if it was reasonable. But even if it wasn't reasonable, I would consider it at least.
No, that's an interesting perspective because, gosh, isn't that kind of, we want to have trust, we want to be able to be believable, we want to be able to count on people. And here's Charles Manson, who the system, for all intents and purposes, altered his state of mind and his life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, definitely, his state of mind and his life was a result of being in the system. Definitely, not just the prison system, but the men who raised him were military men, and he learned about procedures and orders and hierarchies and things like that, and that was ingrained in his personality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because the world has, or most of the world, except like yourself, who knows him, and a few others, the world paints a picture that he was this diabolical fiend who somehow had mind control over this counterculture movement, and was basically creating these autotons to go out and do heinous crimes.
Yeah,
that's what most of the world thanks still, I think.
Well, that is a great story, but it is just a story. I mean, so much of what they say Charlie did about interacting with other people has a negative tint to it, because anything he did, he had to be scheming. If he was nice to somebody, it wasn't because he was genuinely being nice to them and was interested in their life and their problems and wanted to help them. He was always up to something. He was always conning them. And it's like, I wonder if he was conning everybody, when did he cash in on the con? Because when they arrested him, he had nothing. He was out in the desert with nothing. So it's not like he was living royally off these people. And so, people say, oh, he would find what you were interested in and what you needed, and he would relate to that and help you with your problems, as if that was some kind of bad thing. When, people don't consider, gee, maybe he was actually genuinely interested in this person and not setting them up for something. When I get this image of him being this diabolical criminal mastermind where he's just sitting around rubbing his hands like this going, now who can I fuck over next? It's just so
No, yeah. And when these narratives get painted, and I was reading something on, talking to Jason about this. When you look at the theory of information, I have a really close friend who does a lot of research on that. He says a lot of the stories that we get are either propaganda, I mean, a real high percentage, somebody else's narrative with an agenda, or an opinion that is not based on anything that's factual.
Right.
So when we get, George, and you as an investigative, because I would say you're an investigative author. You're a guy going in there to tinker underneath the hood, the nuts and the bolts of the engine to see how it works. And a lot of people don't do that. Everything's real topical, so for you is topical. People don't like to dig too deep, because heaven forbid that we uncover the truth and then we have to change our whole mindset. And isn't that what this is about? This journey that all of us are on, that we're on some kind of trip to find the truth, or do people care?
Well, I think enough people care that they're still doing it. And there are a lot of people trying to find the truth in a lot of different directions. And I think it is good. But you have to figure there's been almost 50 years of relentless negative propaganda that's just regurgitated over and over again. And so it's impossible. I think about in my lifetime, I expect to turn things around a little bit. But realistically, you just can't counter every lie. I have a podcast where I try to explain my take on the case, and I'm trying to be as clear as I can be and lay everything out and show people things. And this is what I'm using to back up this opinion and this, that, and the other. And they still just come back to me with, I'm sorry, he's a mass murdering guy. So
That's it. That's it.
some people that just cannot open their eyes. I don't know whether they just believe it so much. I think a lot of it is people don't like to consider the fact that something maybe they believed for such a long time is not true. And how does that reflect on their self-image if they
No,
think they're fooled?
that's a freaking great point, man, because we have found this not just with the Charles Manson story, but anything with life.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to be wrong. Nobody
Right.
wants to admit that they believed a lie. And
Mm-hmm.
George, when you point that out, to me, immediately I think of courage. It takes courage to listen to the truth and to admit that maybe some of the things that you've been believing for so long
Mm-hmm.
has been a bunch of nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Guys like you, the way I look at it, and I just met you tonight, those listening and watching, what Jason has told me about you is you're a guy that seeks the truth
Mm-hmm.
and a person that you could put some faith into. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we would like to connect with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that most human beings, correct me if I'm wrong, but I really have a gut feeling that most human beings want to be part of something that's truthful. Is it? I mean, am I wrong?
Yeah, you're probably right. They want to be part of something, that's for sure. I hope they find something that's truthful.
And therein lies the point of 90% of everything out there that my
Right,
friend has found out is propaganda or
right,
narrative or an opinion.
right. Well, this case, I didn't break down every aspect and detail of it, but I figured something like uh, what the standard story of Charlie and the murders, I would say maybe 10% of it's true, uh, 20% of it's totally false, and the remaining 70% is true or is false, but it's based on something that's true. So a lot of times they take
Mm-hmm.
something partially true and exaggerate it out or draw their own conclusion about it and present that as the truth. The more I looked into things in various details, I just got some interesting paperwork yesterday from some woman looking into some of Charlie's early convictions and after he got out and saying, the way it's been presented to the public is not true. It wasn't like that. It was the wife was mad at the husband, so she called the cops, and it had nothing to do with Charlie abusing anybody. He just was the ex-con who got picked up as a result of it. But you're always looking. I was always kind of looking. I've always been kind of waiting to find out I am wrong, but I never have yet.
Interesting. So, it's talking about the case, George, with the detail that and the things that you've been able to decipher.
Mm-hmm.
What are a couple of things about the case that are just utter nonsense that are not true that you would like the listeners to know?
Well, the main thing that's not true is that Charlie directed the people to kill those other people, that he was the mind controlling guru. That's the main
Mm-hmm.
big falsehood. He had influence over other people. He was older than them. He was more experienced than them. It's natural to look up to your elders and listen to what they tell you. It's natural to rely on their experience. So he did have some influence over those people, but he didn't have total mind control over them. And he didn't send them out to kill. They were going out to do something to take care of another problem that arose out of another problem, and it spiraled out of control. It snowballed, if you will, and it just got crazy. And you had people doing drugs that were not conducive to that kind of frame of mind where you're frenzied and upset and on the spot and trying to make decisions when you're speeding. It's not smart. So the main thing is that the perception of him as the homicide obsessed, mind controlling guru who sent slaves out to commit murder so that he could ignite a race war, that's the main falsehood, because those murders didn't happen to ignite a race war. The main reason those people went out on that night was because Bobby Beausoleil had been arrested 2 days earlier for the murder of Gary Hinman, and they were doing something, committing copycat murders to try to throw the police off Hinman's, Beausoleil's trail. Bad plan. But, again, when you're abusing drugs, and that can happen. It can cloud your thinking. And I don't know if you've had any experience with amphetamines, but a lot of the people, two of the main people who were the murderers, Charles Watson and Susan Atkins, admitted pretty steady amphetamine use. And I've done enough amphetamines to know that it can make you think that a really stupid idea is really brilliant.
No, I get that.
And yeah, this will work. Sure. No, it won't.
So So that narrative that's been painted of Charles Manson, I've heard conversation of the scapegoat to end the counterculture. I've heard that. And is there any relevance to that narrative that this case was used to close the door on higher consciousness?
I think I cringe every time I hear that Charlie killed the 60s in 1969, as if 1968 was a picnic with King getting killed and RFK getting killed and the Chicago riots, like everything was great up until August of 1969. It was already terrible for at least a year before that. So he had nothing to do with crashing the so-called dream of the 1960s and the summer of love and all that stuff. So I think he's kind of been used as a scapegoat to explain. I think a lot of people, a thought I had many years ago was there were two things that happened in the late 60s and early 70s that showed that the situation between young people and old people, which is the main conflict at that time that I see, was the Tate-LaBianca murders and Kent State were showing that it was getting to a position where you were going to have to either kill or be killed. And I think that when people saw that this is getting really serious, a lot of people pulled back and they got away from that idealism.
Yeah, good point, because, we can go into, narratives on the Black Panther Party, to empower Black people in the inner city and, what they ended up being, was that how they really started? American Indian movement on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and the Peltier case. And you're right, you pointed out, George, that was not peace and love and moon pies. There was a lot of issues and things going on, and the assassinations that you just mentioned. A lot going on. There was something going on in America at that
time. And there were the Weatherman bombings and all sorts of things, violent riots. Violence was you have to. Man has a tendency to violence. Violence can be used for good, and a revolution often has violence, and you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So it's not pretty. So I think at that time there was really a thought of the consciousness of the level of commitment that would lead to killing. But you also have to consider this. When you look at the case of Charlie, and you have to go back and look at the events of that summer to get a real understanding of what led up to those murders. And it started with when Charles Watson burned Bernard Crowe for a pot deal. And one thing about this case is it's so complicated, you can go on and on and on talking about every
no, but it's fascinating. People want to know.
Charlie had to go down and take care of that problem. It was not his problem. And Crowe is, if you've seen episode number 3 of my podcast, I laid out pretty clearly that Crowe was threatening the ranch seriously to burn it down and rape the women and kill everybody there, use the word kill. Charlie went down to take care of it and ended up having to shoot him for the people at the ranch. And he thought he had killed him. He didn't know he survived, but he thought he had killed him. And everybody at the ranch thought he had killed him. So their level of commitment was automatically raised. He killed for us. Our level of commitment to him has been raised to that. How could we do any less than what he did for us already? And this is one of the things that gets me is, and I don't want to get off on a Christian bent too much, but the quote, John 15:13 fits it perfectly. Greater love hath no man that a man lay down his life for his friends. And that's what Manson did when he shot Bernard Crowe. And they recognized that. And that was the root of their devotion to him, because he had already showed what he would do for them. So they were going to show him what they would do for him.
Right. And it kind of closed the circle. Then that was, I didn't even know about that case.
Yeah.
Or that event.
That little detail about the shooting of Bernard Crowe is one of the most overlooked incidents of that summer, and yet it is the trigger for everything that happened. It's the most important thing. If that had not happened, there would have been no Tate-LaBianca murders.
So it was like you had mentioned the word snowball, but so there really was never, that could have been a pivotal moment, or probably was the way you described it. But then it just started one event, and it was probably more like that book, The Perfect Storm, when those crimes finally did occur.
Yeah. Well, there was another crime when Bobby Beausoleil killed Gary Hinman, and that involved Hinman going back on his word not to turn Charlie in for cutting his ear. And so Bobby killed him to keep him from turning Charlie in. So Charlie felt he owed a debt to Bobby for killing this fella who was going to send him back to prison. And he told Charles Watson, who owed Charlie a debt for having taken care of the Crow incident, you take care of getting Bobby out of jail. I don't care how you do it, but do it. You owe me, brother. You owe me. And it's hard to imagine the intensity of what that conversation must have been when Charlie took Charles Watson aside that night and said, listen, he puts it kind of in the interview he does with Charlie Rose, a very good interview with Manson. He says, either you pay him what I owe you, or I'll pay you what I owe you. And that says it all. I'm really going to take care of it. And I just can't imagine Charles Watson being anything but wired on amphetamines and just rigid with intense energy from Charlie really chewing him out and saying, you get him out of jail now. I don't care what you do. I've had a few arguments with Charlie. It was he's a forceful personality.
Yeah, interesting. So there's a main story that's told, then there's a lot of hidden details, is the way I would say it. I mean, and those are the things that guys like you yourself that investigate and write on. And what conclusions, other than the fact that he was not this psycho crazy, mind controlling, psychopathic, crazy guy, what other conclusions, without giving away the book, because we want people to get the book, but what are some of the conclusions that you draw from the whole thing, that the whole 60s, the whole story, and then with Jason Freeman and Jason's story?
One of them, well, like there are so many, there's so much time, years and years and decades actually, and so many things. It would be hard to say the main thing I drew from it, but I really, the main thing I drew from it was how wrong everybody, most people, what they think about it is. It's just not what happened. And there's a lot of residual resistance to hearing anything new. I get a lot of supportive messages from people who appreciate my book and my podcast and the work I do. And it's all very thoughtful. And then I get knee-jerk negative reactions that just say I'm crazy. A lot fewer of those. But it's the main thing. It would be hard to say what the main thing I took away from it was. It was an experience. I think about Charlie a lot, and I've really looked at him and everything I know about him and everything I observed about him. And I go over it with my mind constantly. What about this? Was he really that? Was I mistaken about that? Where can you find something about this? Because you have to take into consideration his personality, it was very, very hard to, to just come to a conclusion. And I still think about it a lot.
Can you? Thanks, George. Can you share maybe one time or maybe a story about Charlie himself when you guys just leveled on a human one-on-one basis, and maybe what that conversation was about, where you saw something totally different? I know you saw it a lot of times, but maybe one conversation in particular that sticks out where you say you guys are talking mano a mano, human to human.
I have to say, honestly, Charlie and I didn't have a lot of deep conversations about things because we were doing things. And I was always doing things for him. And he would say, can you do this? Can you do that? And I try to figure out how to do it. So we did talk a lot about the crime, but my main interest really was to get to know him as a person and serve him to the best of my ability, because I saw him. I was shocked when I got close to him to realize that he had really nobody helping him outside. With all his fame, I would have thought there were, an army of people ready to do stuff on his behalf. And there was really nobody there. And a lot of people trying to take advantage of him inside and outside. So there was a lot of that going on, and trying to balance all that and do things for him. The main thing, people say, what was the thing you remember about him best? Was I really liked it when we could kind of get over on authority. And I won't go into a lot of details, but that was really satisfying.
It's kind of like that song "Smoking in the Boys' Room." Just hey, we're getting away with something, and it makes you feel good, and it's empowering.
What can you do? Can we do this? Can we do that? He was always interested and eager to do things, very enthusiastic about what he could do.
That's interesting. So,
he would ask me things, and I would never, no matter what he said, I always took him seriously. And, he would ask me things that people think are crazy. Like once he said, can you get me a gun? And I said, most people would say, well, you're crazy. I'm not going to try to get a gun in here. But I looked around and I looked at this and that and the other thing. And I looked at everything. And I went in one day and said, I could get you a gun, but if one person was not looking the right way, it would be really bad. And people won't do it then.
So there was a little bit of I'm like hearing the vibe of a sense of humor going on there.
Yeah. He said he would always say, when are you going to get me out of here? And so one day he said, have you figured out how to get me out of here yet? And I said, yeah, I have. Actually, I've been giving it a lot of thought. I'm going to need 6 guys exactly like me, and we're going to have to take hostages. And he said, no, we're not doing that.
So he was believing you too, maybe. I don't know. That's funny, man.
I always took everything he said seriously, and I did try to look into things. I'm a very cautious, conservative person, and I'm not going to do anything recklessly to jeopardize what we had going. There were a lot of things he wanted me to do that I thought we're going to get caught if we do that, and that would not be good. I'd rather keep doing what we're doing. So I really can't go into, I don't want to go into a lot of details about that, but I really did everything I could for him because, boy, he sure deserved it. I'll tell you.
Well, good for you. And what were George, what were some of the things he said about Jason?
I never
did he ever discuss?
I never talked to him about Jason. Charlie and I had a difference of perceptions, if you will, in about 2001, and I didn't talk to him again for about 15 years. There were several reasons for that. One was that for a long period, I was not allowed to talk to him because I was talking to Lynette Fromey, and the authorities said I couldn't talk to both of them because they thought I would be passing secret messages back and forth, and the family would come back to life. And so I was not allowed to talk to him for several years. When my book came out, the first thing I did when my book came out was send him a copy before I even picked them all up, before I went back to get the next load. I had it in the mail to him. So, but I never really talked to him about the book, because he would call sometimes and I'd say, Charlie, I can't talk to you because if I talk to you, uh, they'll say, "Why are you talking to him?" And they could put a hurt on Lynn if that were the case. It was an issue of keeping her because
Right.
yeah, I remember when she called because they'd found her phone number in his cell, and they were very upset about that. So I
So what
didn't.
did they think he
I,
was going to do?
I couldn't even talk to anybody who knew him. I couldn't. Not only could I not talk to him, but I couldn't talk to anybody who knew him, like Gray Wolf and Star, whom I knew, but I was not able to talk to them because I didn't want them saying. Because if you do talk to them, somebody will tell. Unfortunately, and even though you're not doing anything, you know.
So
So
there was a directive then to just kind of keep everybody on the ropes or everybody quiet.
they didn't want anybody talking. I don't know what they didn't want them talking about. They wouldn't let Sandra Good visit. They wouldn't let her go in and see somebody she'd known for 35 years and sit down and visit and have a candy bar because they thought they would be up to God knows what.
Yeah, yeah, and there you go. And you mentioned at the beginning, this negative aura about everything Charles Manson, and it's almost like they built a plot to confuse and to distort the truth.
Sure they did.
And I'm wondering, what the intention would be, because the truth, like you said, George, that none of it was really true, the persona that was made out to be. And so the intent there to stifle the truth, it's nothing different than we see in a lot of places these days.
Oh yeah. It's frustrating to me to see what passes for news and government statements these days. It's really annoying and frustrating to see what they try to pass off.
And it is. And that's why I think, most people these days, we talk to people all the time, the people don't know what to believe anymore. There used to be a certain level of faith that you could have in people when they told you something.
Right.
But like you just said, George, the sensationalism and the news that's out there, like my good friend has found out, is propaganda for some means to an end. Confusion, derision, who knows what.
Well, I think a lot of it is to keep people confused and excited and anxious, and therefore they're dependent on you. If you can keep somebody anxious about, say, COVID, then they're going to have to tune in tomorrow to see what they should do about it. So they create problems and inflate things and distort them and make them the priorities. Basically, they tell people what to think. That's what the news media does. It tells people what they're going to think about. It picks so many stories going in so many directions, and they put them out there, and this is what you're supposed to think. And if they don't want you to think it or know it, they just won't tell you. And then you don't know it.
That is what we call deductive reasoning and logic. And obviously, George, you're well schooled in those areas of the mind, and that's cool, man. I love, Jason. Jason, I've been talking about this. I love people like yourself who think for themselves and understand why we use logic and reason to deduce our own truths from the truths that are out there, but in a positive way.
Well,
you're a conduit, man. Just face it, George. You're a conduit.
Charlie, he said I was an iconoclast. I had to go look it up.
I have to look it up, but that's a compliment, and to a certain extent, and that's what we want more of. I'm telling you, man. I believe personally that most people want to hear the truth. Nobody likes being lied to, unless you're just some kind of a masochistic wild person. Tell me more lies, George.
Some people I think for whatever reason want to be lied to and they want to be abused. I certainly don't. I've always been into reality. You talk about true, something's either, what it boils down to me is something's either real or it is not. There's no middle ground. There's no real shade of gray there. Something's either real or it's not. So what is it? You can't say, well, it's sort of real, but sort of not. You're fudging, you're distracting, and you're trying to, change the subject and not face the issue. And a lot of times the truth isn't pleasant. You might say, gee, the only way I can figure this out so it makes sense is to have this bad thing. Well, then I'm sorry, the bad thing is true. Don't
No,
say,
absolutely. Yeah.
I don't want to believe the bad thing, so it's a mystery. How did he get out? How did he get these people to go out and murder for him? Gee, what a mystery that is. No, it isn't. He didn't do it.
And that's where, George, what you just made
Your
me,
premise is wrong. You're going
that's
off,
what,
your whole premise is wrong, and you can't address somebody who's going off on the wrong premise. Gee, it's not a mystery if you believe it happened and you don't understand it. Maybe it didn't happen.
that's a good point. And what you made me just think about just now, a lot of good things actually, but you made me just think about common sense
Yeah,
and lack thereof.
yeah.
And you just made that so apparent. And don't you think the world, and this is rhetorical, obviously, and we know the answer, don't you think the world needs more common sense?
Well, common sense. Like I subscribe to Occam's razor, the theory of Occam's razor. The solution that is the least complicated is usually the one that's true. So, when I see people constructing these Rube Goldberg kind of scenarios around the Tate-LaBianca murders to bring in every clue and every witness statement and construct this elaborate story, or on the other hand, it could be a rather more simple explanation. Maybe it's not as splashy and dramatic as you'd like, but it's just a series of bad decisions and criminal activity that got out of hand, and it really got out of hand. But that's what it was.
And you just pointed that out so eloquently because it's a series of events. Maybe singly, they were not good, but
Mm-hmm.
totality, it just made the whole thing like this huge tidal wave.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like about what you said earlier is that that the Tate-LaBianca murders did not really effectively end the 60s or the counterculture, but were a piece to the puzzle that
Mm-hmm.
may or may not have been something that was used for some bigger scheme or bigger plan. The
Mm-hmm.
way the narrative was put out there, because to make this one guy, this, like we've described them, that did all of these heinous things, and oh my gosh, if we have people like that, we certainly have to quash those people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm amazed at some of the people, a little bit that I know about the case. I'm amazed at some of the people that had direct criminal involvement who walked scot free, and I don't pass judgment on anybody. I'm just talking about the case itself.
No, they had to they had to construct it to fit their story. So sure, if somebody didn't fit, you just cut them loose.
Right. So how can people tell us a little bit how they can get your book, and then tell us, George, a little bit about your podcast and how they can go find that?
Oh, well, my book's called Goodbye Helter Skelter. You can go to www.goodbyehelterskelter.com and order it, or you can get it on Amazon.com. And my podcast is something I started doing about a year ago, which I've done 10 episodes so far, which is basically those episodes are a podcast version of my book. And now that I'm done with the podcast version of my book, I'm going to expand out and do some things like look at some of the other cases of the book and critique them and see what I disagree with about them or that I can point out that is not correct. So I'm working right now on a review of Jeff Wynn's book, Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, which is accepted pretty much as a good source. He's been on a lot of TV shows, but he said a lot of bad things and wrong things and easily demonstrably wrong things that I want to point out. So people look a little bit more at look away from what the herd is thinking, really.
And it's funny that you said that. You kind of read my mind. Huh. What do you want with your audience and the people that are into crime and criminal cases and things like this? What do you want readers and listeners of your podcast to know? What advice can you give them?
Well, I guess it's over simple to say, like, just don't believe everything. If you're interested in something, pursue it as much as you can. And don't, like I said earlier, if you read Helter Skelter and that's nothing else you read, that's a great story. Wow, I know everything. But if you start looking at everything else, it starts to fall apart. So if you're interested in something, pursue it. This is just what I happen to, one of my main interests. I have other things. It's not what I do all the time. That's why my podcast comes out maybe once a month because I'm busy doing other things. But really, if you're interested in something, look into it. You might be surprised that what you believe isn't true, or you might be surprised to learn that what you believe is true. But
Great.
at least follow through and pursue it. Don't believe what you're told.
Great.
I'm not saying disbelieve everything that you're told, but certainly just don't blindly believe it.
There you have it. Don't be blind. And that's good advice. And we appreciate your time, George. George Stimson's been our guest today on the Redemption
Okay.
Files, Redemption podcast with Jason Freeman. He is the author of Goodbye, Helter Skelter, a new look at the Tate-LaBianca murders. And for those of you who are listening to the show, I encourage you to take George's information and go get the book and read it for yourself and make your own conclusions. But
Right. And all the podcast episodes are on YouTube on the Goodbye Helter Skelter channel. So you can watch them there.
And there you go. So, and visit the podcast, because if you're truthfully interested in finding out facts and real things, like George said earlier, then he's got the resources to do it. And I encourage everybody to go do that. And then that way you're just not, according to George, blindly following something that's not true.
And if you see something I write that you don't like, let me know. I'm happy to hear from anybody that has a serious, legitimate question or a different point of view. Many of the criticisms I get are not worth the time to respond to because the people are not hearing what I'm saying in the first place. But occasionally I get one that asks an honest question about something, and I'll look into it and I'll respond. By all means, question me. Like I say in my first episode of my podcast, show me that I'm wrong.
There you go. Show George that he's wrong. And if you can prove it, we'll buy you a latte someday. But anyhow, Jason, thanks for being here also. We love you, man. And George, keep up the great work. I appreciate your time. And I'll look forward to our next conversation.
Sure. Okay. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Redemption Podcast Show and this exclusive series of the Truth Files. Without your support, there is no show. Join us next time for more truth, more redemption. Everybody knows we can all use some. Thank you.